Hey folks, welcome to this channel where we dive deep into the stories that have shaped our world. Today, we explore one of the most monumental events in modern history, the Boer War and the rise and fall of apartheid in South Africa. From the roots of colonialism to the fierce resistance of the Boers and the eventual triumph of democracy, this narrative encapsulates the struggle for freedom, equality, and reconciliation. This journey is not only about the history of a nation, but about how the fight for justice can change the course of a people's future. Stay with us as we walk through this transformative period of history and explore the themes of resilience, resistance, and the power of unity. Ready to dive in? Let's go. The Boer migration traces its roots back to the 17th century when Dutch settlers, known as Boers, first arrived at the Cape of Good Hope under the Dutch East India Company. Initially, the settlement was intended as a refreshment station for ships traveling between Europe and the East Indies. However, over time, the Boers established farms, expanding the colony. This settlement was crucial in the development of South Africa, as the Boers became the dominant European presence in the region. By the early 19th century, the Cape Colony had fallen under British control, but tensions between the Boers and the British were beginning to rise. The Boers resented British policies, particularly those that sought to limit their independence and control over their land. After Britain took control of the Cape Colony in 1806, tensions between the Boers and the British escalated. The British had a different approach to governance and the economy, which often conflicted with Boer values and way of life. British abolition of slavery in 1834 angered many Boers, as slavery was deeply entrenched in their agricultural economy. Additionally, the British attempts to centralize control over the colony and impose British law, such as the English language and Protestantism, further alienated the Boers. The Boers, who valued their autonomy and conservative way of life, felt increasingly oppressed and marginalized under British rule. These tensions laid the groundwork for the Great Trek, a mass migration of Boers into the interior of southern Africa. In the early 1830s, as discontent with British rule grew, many Boers began to seriously consider leaving the Cape Colony. The driving forces behind this decision included the desire for more fertile land, freedom from British control, and the hope of creating a society where they could live according to their own values. The idea of a Great Trek emerged as Boers sought to move beyond the British frontier, away from the confines of colonial rule. The Great Trek was not a single event, but rather a gradual movement of settlers over several years, with various groups of Boers heading in different directions. This migration was fueled by a desire for self-determination and the opportunity to establish independent Boer republics. The Boers' sense of identity and their view of themselves as pioneers and settlers drove them to confront the challenges that lay ahead. The first organized Boer migration began in 1835 with a group of settlers led by Peter Retief and Gert Maritz. These pioneers set out from the Cape Colony with the goal of establishing a new home in the interior of southern Africa. They crossed the Orange River, an important natural boundary, and entered the land of the Nguni-speaking peoples. The trekkers encountered numerous difficulties, including harsh terrain, lack of supplies, and the threat of African resistance. The Boers were primarily farmers, not soldiers, and they were unprepared for the challenges posed by the African kingdoms in the region. However, despite these setbacks, they pressed on, driven by a strong belief in their destiny to build a new life free from British interference. As the Boers moved deeper into the interior, they encountered various African kingdoms, including the Zulu, the Xhosa, and the Basotho. These kingdoms had long-established territories, and their rulers were wary of the European settlers. The interaction between the Boers and the African kingdoms was marked by tension and conflict. In particular, the Zulu kingdom, led by King Shaka Zulu, proved to be a formidable force that resisted Boer encroachment. The Zulu were a powerful military force, and their warriors clashed with Boer settlers who sought to establish farms and communities on land that was traditionally occupied by the Zulu. The Boers' attempts to negotiate land deals and establish peaceful relations with African rulers often ended in failure, as misunderstandings and mistrust on both sides led to violent confrontations. The early stages of the Great Trek had significant implications for both the Boers and the African kingdoms. For the Boers, the migration provided an opportunity to assert their independence and create new communities, but it also exposed them to the harsh realities of life in the interior. The African kingdoms, in turn, were faced with the challenge of dealing with European settlers who sought to claim land and resources that had previously been under African control. The interaction between the Boers and the African kingdoms set the stage for the many conflicts that would follow, as both sides sought to defend their territories and assert their dominance in the region. Despite the hardships, the Boers persevered, and their presence in the interior began to solidify. As the Boers journeyed deeper into the interior of southern Africa, they sought to establish independent communities and farming settlements. They founded a number of towns and settlements, including the first successful Boer republics, such as the Natalia Republic and the Orange Free State. The establishment of these republics was driven by the desire for self-governance and freedom from British colonial rule. These early settlements were built on land that had traditionally been occupied by African kingdoms, and the Boers quickly began to develop agricultural economies based on livestock farming, maize, and other crops. The rural Boer lifestyle was central to the development of these early republics, and the Boers took pride in their ability to thrive in harsh conditions. The establishment of the first Boer republics was not without challenges. The Boers had to contend with difficult geography, a lack of infrastructure, and hostile relations with neighboring African kingdoms. For example, the Natalia Republic, founded in the 1830s in present-day KwaZulu-Natal, was short-lived due to the fierce resistance of the Zulu kingdom. The Zulu, under King Dingaan, saw the Boers as a threat to their sovereignty and attacked them in 1838, leading to the infamous Battle of Blood River. Despite the challenges, the Boers remained resolute in their pursuit of independence, and the republics continued to expand. The Boers' relationship with the Zulu kingdom, led by King Shaka and later his successors, was one of the most intense and enduring conflicts of the Great Trek. The Zulu were a powerful military force and had established a highly organized kingdom with a well-trained army. When the Boers began to settle on land that the Zulu considered part of their territory, tensions reached a boiling point. In 1838, the Boers, led by Andries Pretorius, faced off against the Zulu at the Battle of Blood River, one of the most significant confrontations of the period. The Boers, numbering around 470, were vastly outnumbered by the Zulu forces, who had over 10,000 warriors. Despite this disparity, the Boers were able to hold their ground and achieved a decisive victory. The Battle of Blood River marked a turning point in the conflict between the Boers and the Zulu, and it symbolized the Boers' determination to resist African resistance and establish their dominance in the region. The victory at Blood River allowed the Boers to consolidate their hold over the Natal region, and the Zulu kingdom was severely weakened, though not entirely defeated. The events of Blood River would become a key part of Boer mythology and national identity, celebrated as a divine victory by the Boers. As the Boers established more successful settlements and republics in the interior, they began to expand further into the African heartlands. The movement into these regions was driven by the need for fertile land to support the growing Boer population and economy. The Boers also sought to escape from British influence and create a society based on their own values and beliefs. This expansion brought the Boers into conflict not only with the Zulu, but also with other African kingdoms and tribes, such as the Basotho and the Xhosa. One of the most significant Boer migrations during this period was into the Orange Free State, a region that was initially inhabited by the Basotho people. The Basotho, led by King Moshoeshoe, resisted Boer settlement in the area, which led to a series of skirmishes and wars. The Boers, with their superior firearms and military tactics, were able to gain control of large portions of Basotho territory. However, Moshoeshoe proved to be a shrewd leader and negotiated peace with the Boers in the 1840s, establishing a degree of autonomy for the Basotho. Despite the tensions and conflicts, the Boers continued to expand, and the interior of southern Africa gradually became a patchwork of Boer republics, African kingdoms, and competing interests. The British played a significant role in shaping the events that led to the Great Trek. Following their acquisition of the Cape Colony, the British implemented a number of policies that were deeply unpopular with the Boers. One of the most contentious issues was the abolition of slavery in 1834, which greatly disrupted the Boers' agricultural economy. Many Boers relied on enslaved labor to maintain their farms, and the British policy of emancipation led to a sense of economic and social upheaval. The Boers felt that their way of life was under threat, and their resentment of British rule intensified. In addition to the abolition of slavery, the British also sought to centralize governance and impose their legal system on the Cape Colony. The Boers, who were accustomed to a more decentralized and self-reliant form of governance, resisted these efforts. The British also introduced the idea of representative government, but many Boers felt that they were being excluded from political power. These policies further alienated the Boers and contributed to their decision to migrate into the interior. The British government, concerned about the Boer migration and the establishment of independent Boer republics, responded with a series of military and diplomatic measures. Initially, the British hoped that the Boers would return to the fold of the Cape Colony. But when it became clear that the Boers were determined to stay in the interior, the British began to take a more aggressive stance. The British sought to contain the Boers by asserting their authority over the regions in which they settled, particularly in areas like Natal and the Orange Free State. The British also sought to counter the Boer presence by fostering alliances with African kingdoms, such as the Zulu and the Xhosa, who were hostile to the Boers. The British hoped that by supporting African resistance to Boer expansion, they could prevent the Boers from establishing permanent settlements in the interior. However, these strategies were met with mixed results. While the British were able to disrupt some Boer settlements and impose their influence on certain regions, they were never able to fully stamp out the Boer presence in the interior. The impact of British colonialism on the Boers was profound and enduring. The Boers viewed themselves as a distinct group with their own identity, separate from the British, and they sought to preserve their independence and way of life. The British, on the other hand, saw the Boers as part of their colonial empire and sought to exert control over their activities. This tension between British colonial ambitions and Boer desire for independence would ultimately lead to further conflicts, including the Anglo-Zulu War in 1879 and the Anglo-Boer War in the late 19th century. Despite the challenges posed by British colonial rule, the Boers' determination to establish independent republics in the interior laid the groundwork for the future political landscape of South Africa. The Boer Great Trek, with its complex interactions between European settlers and African kingdoms, marked the beginning of a new chapter in the history of Southern Africa. The legacy of the Trek would shape the course of South African history for generations to come. As the Great Trek progressed, the Boers, often referred to as Voortrekkers, which translates to pioneers, ventured further into the interior regions of southern Africa. These settlers were highly motivated by a desire for religious freedom, the promise of fertile land, and an escape from British authority. The Voortrekkers traveled by ox-drawn wagons and lived a rugged, self-sustaining life, often in isolation from the more established colonies. These early migrations into the interior played a pivotal role in shaping the geopolitical landscape of southern Africa. The Voortrekkers' movements were not just about expansion, but about securing autonomy from external influence, particularly the British and indigenous African kingdoms. This mindset fueled the development of their own communities and eventually republics. However, as they moved into new territories, they encountered fierce resistance from both indigenous groups and other European settlers who had also laid claim to these lands. The expansion was marked by a series of violent confrontations, with the Boers fighting to claim territories and establish settlements. The Voortrekkers' resilience in the face of hardship and their determination to carve out a new society were key factors in their eventual success. The Voortrekkers' conflict with the indigenous populations was inevitable, as the land they sought to occupy was already inhabited. The Khoikhoi, Xhosa, and other African tribes had lived on these lands for centuries, and their response to the Voortrekkers' encroachment was often defensive and confrontational. Despite the Boers' determination, the violent clashes with these groups highlighted the fundamental differences between the European settlers' approach to land ownership and the indigenous people's understanding of territorial rights. Among the most significant confrontations between the Boers and African kingdoms during the Great Trek was the conflict with the Zulu kingdom, which led to the infamous Battle of Blood River in 1838. The Boers, led by Andries Pretorius, had established settlements in the region known as Natalia, in present-day KwaZulu-Natal, which was controlled by the Zulu under King Dingaan. As the Boers expanded their settlements in the region, tensions between the Boers and the Zulu escalated. The conflict reached its peak when Dingaan ordered the massacre of a Boer party led by Piet Retief, a leader of the Voortrekkers and his followers. Retief and his group had been negotiating with Dingaan for land, but after a series of miscommunications and disputes, Dingaan turned on the Boers, killing nearly all of them in a brutal massacre. In retaliation, Pretorius led a group of Boers, numbering around 470, to launch an attack on the Zulu kingdom. On December 16, 1838, the Boers met the Zulu forces at the Battle of Blood River. The Boers, fortified in a laager, a defensive wagon circle, faced off against an estimated 10,000 Zulu warriors. Despite the overwhelming numbers of the Zulu, the Boers were able to hold their ground, using their superior firearms and disciplined tactics to inflict heavy casualties on the Zulu forces. The Boers won a decisive victory, killing around 3,000 Zulu warriors while suffering only 3 casualties of their own. The Battle of Blood River was a turning point in the Boer-Zulu conflict. It marked the beginning of the decline of Zulu power in the region and solidified the Boers' control over large portions of the Natal region. The victory was seen by the Boers as a divine intervention and became an important part of their national mythos. To this day, December 16th is celebrated by Afrikaners as a day of remembrance and pride. The aftermath of the Battle of Blood River was a period of consolidation for the Boers. After their victory, they established the Natalia Republic, but their control over the region was short-lived. The British, who had their own interests in Natal, quickly intervened and annexed the territory in 1843, establishing it as a British colony. The annexation of Natal was a significant setback for the Boers, but did not mark the end of their ambitions. The Boers continued to push into the interior, founding the Orange Free State and the South African Republic, commonly known as the Transvaal. The Boers' ability to maintain their independence in the face of British expansion was a defining feature of the Great Trek. Although their republics were not recognized by the British, the Boers continued to establish self-governing communities, often through treaties or military victories. The tensions between the Boers and the British continued to simmer, eventually leading to the Boer Wars later in the 19th century. However, the legacy of the Great Trek had already been secured. The Boers had established a lasting presence in southern Africa, and their republican ideals had continued to shape the future of the region. The Zulu kingdom, while severely weakened by the battle, did not disappear entirely. The Zulu kingdom would continue to exist under new leadership, though it never regained the power and influence it once had. The Boers' ability to establish and maintain their republics in the face of such adversity is a testament to their determination and resilience, but also highlighted the ongoing conflict and complex relationships between European settlers and indigenous African kingdoms in southern Africa. As the Boers continued their migrations and established republics in the interior, the British government grew increasingly concerned about their actions. The British had already annexed the Cape Colony and Natal, and the Boer expansion into regions like the Orange Free State and Transvaal threatened British influence over the entire southern African region. British officials viewed the Boer republics as a challenge to their authority and sought to prevent the establishment of any further independent Boer territories. In 1848, the British attempted to reassert their control over the Orange Free State by sending a military force to occupy the region. However, the Boers, led by Andries Pretorius, fiercely resisted the British incursion. The British troops were not prepared for the harsh terrain or the determined resistance of the Boers, and the attempted occupation was unsuccessful. The Boers managed to retain control of the Orange Free State, and their independence was further cemented. The failure of British efforts to quash the Boer republics left the British government with two choices: either continue to engage in costly military campaigns to assert control or attempt to negotiate a political solution. In response to the growing tensions between the British and the Boers, the British government agreed to enter into negotiations with the Boers. One of the key moments in these negotiations came in 1852 with the signing of the Sand River Convention, which formally recognized the independence of the South African Republic, Transvaal, and the Orange Free State. The Sand River Convention was a significant diplomatic victory for the Boers, as it acknowledged their right to self-governance without British interference. The Sand River Convention established the principle of laissez-faire governance, which meant that the British would not interfere in the internal affairs of the Boer republics, as long as they did not pose a threat to British interests in southern Africa. The agreement allowed the Boers to consolidate their republics and focus on internal development. However, tensions with the British were not entirely resolved, and the issue of British imperialism in southern Africa would continue to haunt Boer-British relations in the years to come. The British interference in Boer affairs had long-lasting effects on both the Boers and the indigenous African populations. For the Boers, the British presence in southern Africa was a constant reminder of the tensions between colonial power and Republican independence. The Boer republics, while granted formal recognition in the Sand River Convention, would never be fully free from British influence. British colonial policies would continue to shape the political, social, and economic landscape of southern Africa for decades, culminating in the conflicts of the Anglo-Boer War in the late 19th century. For the indigenous African populations, the British presence meant continued displacement and marginalization. The Boers, like the British, saw the land they occupied as their own to conquer and settle, leading to further conflicts with African kingdoms. The long-term effects of this colonial dynamic would shape the history of southern Africa, setting the stage for the apartheid system and the complex racial politics that would dominate the region in the 20th century. The 1850s and 1860s saw a period of relative stability and growth for the Boer republics, particularly the South African Republic, Transvaal, and the Orange Free State. These republics were able to establish their own systems of government, infrastructure, and economy. The Voortrekkers who had migrated into these areas began to organize their societies and laid down the foundations for what would later become the Boer identity. Agriculture, particularly cattle farming, continued to be the cornerstone of the economy, while trade with European powers, including the British and the Portuguese, also began to develop. The Transvaal, in particular, experienced rapid growth as Boer settlers moved into the region, attracted by its rich natural resources, including fertile land and mineral wealth. The discovery of gold and diamonds in the later half of the 19th century would eventually play a major role in reshaping the region's economy and attracting foreign interest. In the Orange Free State, meanwhile, the Boers faced continued pressure from both indigenous African groups and British colonial forces. While the British had formally recognized the republics through the Sand River Convention of 1852 and the Bloemfontein Convention of 1854, tensions remained high. The Boers in the Orange Free State faced increasing pressure from the Xhosa and Basotho, while the Zulu and other groups in the Transvaal remained wary of Boer expansion. Despite these tensions, both republics enjoyed a degree of autonomy and worked hard to maintain independence. This period also marked the consolidation of Boer nationalism, as the settlers increasingly identified as distinct from both the British and the indigenous African populations. The Boers' efforts to preserve their identity as an independent, self-sufficient people were key to the survival of the republics, even in the face of internal and external challenges. Although the British government had officially recognized the independence of the Boer republics, relations between the two powers remained strained. In the late 1850s and early 1860s, the British became more focused on asserting their control over the entire southern African region. Their interest was driven by a desire to consolidate power, secure trade routes, and exploit the vast natural resources of the region, including the gold and diamond reserves that would soon be discovered. This shift in British policy began to place the Boer republics in direct competition with British colonial ambitions. In the Transvaal, British pressure mounted as the British government attempted to increase its influence over the republic. The discovery of gold and the subsequent influx of foreign settlers, many of whom were British, brought new challenges to Boer control of the region. The Boers feared that the influx of foreign settlers, particularly the British, would undermine their political autonomy and their ability to maintain control over the land. The British, for their part, were eager to exert greater influence over the resources of the region, and their growing interest in the gold industry led to mounting tensions with the Boers. Similarly, in the Orange Free State, British colonial officials began to push for greater influence, particularly over the administration of justice and trade. The Boers, however, were determined to maintain their independence and rejected British interference. This growing tension between the Boers and the British would eventually lead to a series of diplomatic confrontations and military clashes, culminating in the Anglo-Zulu War of 1879 and the Anglo-Boer War, 1899 to 1902. The tension between the British and the Boers was further exacerbated by the British support for African groups in the region. The British had long allied themselves with the Zulu, Xhosa, and other African groups as a means of countering Boer expansion. The Boers, on the other hand, saw the British alliances with African groups as a direct threat to their territorial ambitions and their independence. These alliances contributed to the simmering animosity between the Boers and the British, setting the stage for further conflicts in the years to come. While the external pressure from the British and neighboring African kingdoms played a significant role in shaping the Boers' history, internal factors also played a crucial role in the development of Boer society during the mid-19th century. Religion, in particular, was a central element in the daily lives of the Boers and had a profound impact on their worldview and their resistance to both British and indigenous African groups. The Boers were predominantly Calvinist Protestants, with many of them subscribing to a strict interpretation of the Bible. This religious worldview influenced their approach to life in the interior of southern Africa. The Boers saw themselves as God's chosen people, destined to settle the land and establish a new society. Their religious beliefs were intertwined with their political and social structures, and they viewed their independence as not only a matter of personal freedom, but also a divine right. The Boers' strong religious convictions also played a role in their interactions with indigenous African groups. Many Boers believed it was their duty to civilize the indigenous populations, which they viewed as pagan and uncivilized. This paternalistic view was a significant factor in their treatment of African groups, particularly those that resisted Boer settlement. While the Boers had a complex relationship with African groups, sometimes engaging in trade and diplomacy, while other times resorting to violence, their religious convictions often shaped their attitudes toward Africans and influenced their policies of land acquisition and settlement. Internally, the Boer republics faced their own challenges. The growth of the settler population led to increasing competition for resources, land, and labor. Tensions between different Boer factions over governance and leadership also began to emerge, particularly in the Transvaal. The republics were not immune to factionalism, and the growing sense of Boer nationalism was sometimes at odds with the pragmatism required to maintain stability in the republics. This internal instability, combined with external pressures from the British and indigenous African groups, meant that the Boer republics faced significant challenges during this period. In the 1860s, the discovery of gold in the Transvaal marked a pivotal moment in the history of the Boer republics and southern Africa as a whole. The gold discoveries, which were concentrated in areas such as the Witwatersrand, brought an influx of foreign settlers, particularly from Britain and Europe, who sought to capitalize on the new mining opportunities. This influx of people and capital had a profound impact on the political and economic landscape of the Transvaal and the broader region. For the Boers, the gold discoveries were both a blessing and a curse. On the one hand, the newfound wealth provided opportunities for economic growth and development, allowing the Boers to strengthen their republic and build infrastructure. On the other hand, the arrival of foreign miners, many of whom were British, created tensions between the Boers and the newcomers. The Boers feared that their republic's independence would be threatened by the growing influence of British settlers and businessmen who had the financial and political clout to sway the government. The discovery of gold also shifted the balance of power in the region. The British, who had long been interested in controlling the Transvaal due to its strategic location and resources, saw the gold discovery as an opportunity to expand their influence in the region. They pressured the Boer government to grant British miners greater access to the gold fields and sought to integrate the Transvaal into the British colonial system. The Boers, however, were determined to maintain their independence and resisted British attempts to exert control over the gold industry. The economic and social changes brought about by the gold rush were far-reaching. The Transvaal's economy, once primarily based on agriculture, quickly shifted toward mining and industry. The gold industry became a major source of wealth, attracting both foreign and domestic investment. The influx of miners, merchants, and laborers transformed the social fabric of the Transvaal as the population grew rapidly and new towns and settlements sprang up around the gold fields. However, the sudden influx of wealth also exacerbated existing social and political tensions. The Boers, who had traditionally been farmers and were wary of industrialization, struggled to adapt to the demands of a mining economy. The Boers' reliance on manual labor, much of which was supplied by African workers, also led to increased tensions with indigenous African groups as the demand for labor grew. The social divisions between the Boer settlers and the foreign miners were also significant. The Boers viewed themselves as the rightful rulers of the Transvaal, and they resented the growing influence of foreign miners and entrepreneurs, particularly the British. Many of the foreign miners, in turn, were critical of the Boer government's handling of the gold industry and their attempts to limit foreign access to the gold fields. The competition for resources and political power between the Boers and foreign settlers would eventually lead to a series of confrontations, culminating in the Anglo-Boer War at the turn of the century. The discovery of gold in the Transvaal was a catalyst for increased British involvement in Boer affairs. The British, who had long sought to extend their control over southern Africa, saw the wealth of the gold fields as a key to achieving their imperial ambitions. The British government was eager to establish greater control over the gold industry and the political destiny of the Transvaal. In response to Boer resistance, the British began to apply more direct pressure on the Boer government. British officials, led by figures such as Cecil Rhodes and Lord Milner, called for the British government to intervene in Boer affairs to ensure that British miners and businesses had access to the resources in the Transvaal. The British also sought to weaken the Boer government by supporting pro-British factions within the Boer Republic, a strategy that would ultimately lead to the destabilization of Boer control in the region. The British demand for control over the gold fields and their support for anti-Boer factions intensified tensions between the two powers. The Boers, who had already faced pressure from the British in the preceding decades, saw the British intervention in their republics as an existential threat. The British response to Boer resistance would ultimately culminate in the outbreak of the Anglo-Boer War in 1899, which would have profound and lasting consequences for the future of southern Africa. The 1890s were marked by rising tensions between the British Empire and the Boer republics, as the Boer determination to maintain their independence clashed with British imperial ambitions in southern Africa. The discovery of vast gold deposits in the Transvaal in the 1880s had reshaped the economic and geopolitical landscape of the region. The wealth generated from gold mining attracted not only British miners and investors, but also brought an influx of international capital, which further inflamed Boer concerns about British domination. This newfound wealth also made the Transvaal one of the most strategic and valuable territories in southern Africa, increasing British interest in annexing the region. The British Empire, under the leadership of figures such as Cecil Rhodes and Lord Alfred Milner, saw control of the Transvaal as crucial to its imperial ambitions in southern Africa. Cecil Rhodes, the British colonial magnate and founder of the De Beers Mining Company, believed in British expansionism and had a vision of a Cape to Cairo railway linking British colonies across Africa. To achieve this, Rhodes needed to assert British control over the Boer republics, particularly the Transvaal, which had become a powerful and independent state. For the Boers, the British demand for control over the gold resources and their growing influence in the region were seen as a direct threat to their sovereignty. Tensions reached a breaking point in the mid-1890s, with a series of diplomatic and military confrontations that set the stage for the Anglo-Boer War, 1899 to 1902. The Boers, led by the Transvaal's president, Paul Kruger, were determined to resist British interference, but the British Empire's economic and military might would soon force the issue into a brutal conflict. One of the key events that escalated tensions was the Jameson Raid of 1895, a failed attempt by British imperialists, led by Leander Starr Jameson, to incite an uprising among the British expatriates and miners in the Transvaal. The raid was intended to provoke a rebellion and lead to the annexation of the Boer republics by the British. However, the raid ended in disaster, with Jameson and his men being captured by Boer forces. The raid, though unsuccessful, significantly worsened relations between the British and the Boers and fueled Boer fears of British expansionism. The Boers saw the raid as a blatant attempt to undermine their sovereignty, while the British viewed the Boers' resistance as an obstacle to their imperial aspirations. In the years leading up to the Anglo-Boer War, one of the most contentious issues between the British and the Boers was the status of the Uitlanders, or foreign miners, in the Transvaal. The Transvaal had a large influx of foreign miners and workers, many of whom were British subjects. These Uitlanders, who were predominantly British, faced significant legal and political disadvantages in the Boer Republic, including restrictions on voting rights and the ability to hold public office. The British government, under Prime Minister Lord Salisbury, saw the Uitlander issue as a justification for intervention in Boer affairs. The British argued that the rights of the Uitlanders were being violated by the Boer government and that British nationals living in the Transvaal deserved equal treatment and political representation. The Boer government, led by President Paul Kruger, was adamantly opposed to granting political rights to the Uitlanders, fearing that doing so would undermine the independence of the Republic and pave the way for British control. The Uitlander issue was part of a broader pattern of British interference in Boer domestic affairs, which the Boers saw as an infringement on their sovereignty. Tensions over the Uitlanders escalated further when British nationals and miners began to lobby the British government to protect their interests in the Transvaal. The British government responded by applying diplomatic pressure on the Boer government to grant political rights to the Uitlanders. The Boer leadership, however, saw this demand as an unacceptable interference in their internal affairs and rejected it outright. The British were increasingly frustrated by the Boer refusal to grant concessions to the Uitlanders, and their frustration turned into open hostility. The British media, particularly in London, fueled anti-Boer sentiment, portraying the Boer republics as backward and oppressive. At the same time, the Boers viewed British interference as part of a broader scheme to control southern Africa and undermine their independence. The diplomatic standoff over the Uitlanders created a volatile environment, and both sides began to prepare for a potential conflict. By 1899, the diplomatic situation between the British and the Boers had deteriorated to the point where war seemed inevitable. The British, under Lord Milner, who was the British High Commissioner for Southern Africa, had adopted a more aggressive stance towards the Boers, demanding that they grant political rights to the Uitlanders and accept British influence over their internal affairs. Milner's demands were framed as part of a broader British effort to ensure the security and prosperity of the British Empire in southern Africa, but they were seen by the Boers as an existential threat to their independence. In October 1899, after a series of failed diplomatic negotiations, President Paul Kruger of the Transvaal issued an ultimatum to the British government. The Boer ultimatum demanded that British forces be withdrawn from the borders of the Transvaal and that the British cease their interference in Boer affairs. The Boers, led by Kruger, insisted that the British had no right to dictate the internal policies of the Boer republics, and they threatened to take military action if their demands were not met. The British government, led by Prime Minister Lord Salisbury, rejected the ultimatum and tensions reached a boiling point. On October 11th, 1899, the Boers declared war on the British Empire, marking the official beginning of the Anglo-Boer War. The conflict would be one of the most devastating and costly wars in Southern African history, lasting until 1902 and resulting in significant casualties on both sides. The Boers initially had the advantage, thanks to their knowledge of the terrain and their highly effective guerrilla tactics. The British, initially caught off guard, were forced to mobilize large numbers of troops to fight the war. The Boer forces, although outnumbered and under-equipped, quickly scored a series of victories against the British in the early stages of the war. The Boers' use of hit-and-run tactics, combined with their mastery of the rugged South African terrain, gave them a distinct advantage in the early phases of the conflict. As the war unfolded, it became clear that the Boers were not just fighting for their independence, but for the preservation of their way of life against the overwhelming might of the British Empire. The Boer response to British aggression would become a symbol of resistance, and the war would ultimately shape the future of South Africa, leading to the eventual formation of the Union of South Africa in 1910 under British dominion. When the Anglo-Boer War began in October 1899, the Boer forces quickly achieved a series of victories that stunned the British Empire. The Boers were well prepared for the conflict, and their knowledge of the South African landscape proved to be a significant advantage. Under the leadership of General Piet Cronje and other Boer commanders, the Transvaal and Orange Free State forces launched a series of successful offensives against the British in various parts of the country. One of the first major successes for the Boers came at the Battle of Magersfontein, which took place in December 1899. Boer forces, under General Cronje, ambushed a British force led by General Redvers Buller, inflicting heavy losses and forcing the British to retreat. This victory was a major morale booster for the Boers, demonstrating that they were capable of challenging the might of the British military. Another key early victory came at the Battle of Colenso, where Boer forces once again outmaneuvered the British and inflicted significant casualties. The British were caught off guard by the speed and effectiveness of the Boer attacks. The Boers, using guerrilla tactics and their intimate knowledge of the terrain, were able to ambush British supply trains, disrupt British communications, and sabotage infrastructure. These early successes helped to solidify Boer confidence in their ability to resist British domination. The British were forced to rethink their strategy in the face of these early defeats. The Boers, in contrast, saw their successes as proof that they could indeed achieve victory against the British, despite being outnumbered and less equipped. The success of the Boer forces in the early months of the war raised international awareness and sympathy for their cause, with many viewing the conflict as a struggle for independence against imperialism. In response to the Boer victories, the British quickly mobilized more troops to South Africa. British Prime Minister Lord Salisbury, under pressure from both the public and political leaders, committed to a full-scale military campaign to crush the Boer republics and secure British control over southern Africa. General Lord Roberts was appointed to lead the British forces, and he quickly began to organize a large-scale invasion of the Boer territories. One of the most significant military engagements in the early phase of the war was the Siege of Ladysmith. The British garrison in Ladysmith, located in the Natal region, was besieged by Boer forces in October 1899. The siege lasted for several months, with the British troops trapped inside the town and unable to break the Boer blockade. Despite being under siege, the British soldiers held out for months, enduring harsh conditions. The siege became a symbol of British resilience, but it also exposed the vulnerability of British forces in the face of Boer determination. The Boer forces under General Louis Botha took advantage of the siege to launch raids on surrounding British positions and disrupt British supply lines. The Boers' ability to maintain a prolonged siege of a major British garrison was a testament to their military capabilities. Eventually, British reinforcements arrived to break the siege in February 1900, but the event was a significant psychological blow to the British, demonstrating that the Boers were capable of holding their ground against the Empire's might. In the aftermath of the early Boer successes, the British military, under the command of Lord Roberts, began to adapt to the realities of the war. The initial British strategy which relied on traditional military tactics and direct confrontations, had failed to crush the Boer resistance. The Boers, on the other hand, had utilized highly effective guerrilla warfare, taking advantage of their knowledge of the terrain and their ability to conduct hit-and-run attacks. The Boer forces were spread out across vast distances, making it difficult for the British to engage them in large, conventional battles. Instead, the Boers focused on disrupting British supply lines, attacking isolated garrisons, and inflicting heavy casualties on British forces through ambushes and raids. Lord Roberts, who was appointed Commander-in-Chief of British forces in southern Africa in December 1899, understood that the British needed a more strategic approach. He shifted the focus of British operations to securing key Boer territories and laying siege to the Boer capitals of Pretoria and Bloemfontein. Lord Roberts also sought to cut off Boer supply routes and isolate Boer forces by advancing on multiple fronts. In the early stages of his counteroffensive, Roberts achieved several important successes, including the capture of Bloemfontein in March 1900 and the subsequent fall of Pretoria in June 1900. Despite these victories, the Boers were far from defeated. The British Army's reliance on conventional warfare was still at odds with the Boer strategy of guerrilla warfare. The Boer forces, led by generals such as Louis Botha and Koos de la Rey, continued to carry out successful raids on British supply depots and communication lines, making it difficult for the British to maintain control over the newly captured territories. The Boers were resourceful and adapted quickly to British military tactics, often ambushing British patrols or sabotaging infrastructure. After the fall of the Boer capitals, the conflict evolved into a more protracted and devastating war of attrition, marked by intense guerrilla warfare. The Boers, who had previously fought in conventional battles, now relied heavily on their guerrilla tactics to harass and demoralize the British forces. These tactics were particularly effective because of the vast and challenging terrain of the Transvaal and Orange Free State, which the British were ill-prepared to navigate. The Boers used small, mobile units to strike at weak points in the British supply lines, sabotage railways, and ambush isolated British columns. One of the most important aspects of the Boer guerrilla warfare was their use of commando units. These commandos were typically made up of small, highly mobile groups of fighters who could move quickly and attack with precision. The Boers' knowledge of the local geography allowed them to remain hidden and avoid direct confrontations with larger British forces. This hit-and-run approach allowed the Boers to engage the British in a manner that maximized their strengths while minimizing their weaknesses. The Boers also made effective use of the natural landscape to their advantage. The rugged mountains and dense bush of the Transvaal and Orange Free State provided cover for Boer commandos, who could easily disappear into the landscape after an attack. The British, who relied on conventional warfare and had little experience in fighting such irregular tactics, struggled to adapt to the ever-changing nature of the Boer offensive. The British were often forced to pursue Boer forces across vast distances, exhausting their resources and manpower. This war of attrition wore down the British Army, which began to lose its initial momentum. The Boer guerrilla tactics were not without cost, however. While the Boers were able to inflict significant damage on the British forces, they were also subject to brutal reprisals. The British responded to Boer raids with increasingly harsh measures, such as the destruction of Boer farms and the displacement of civilians. This scorched earth policy was aimed at denying the Boers resources and support, but it also resulted in widespread suffering among the civilian population. The British began to round up Boer families and place them in concentration camps, where conditions were dire and many civilians died from disease and malnutrition. The Boer forces were caught between their own tactics of resistance and the suffering inflicted on their people by the British reprisals. As the Anglo-Boer War dragged on, both sides sought international support and attempted to sway public opinion to their cause. The Boers, who had long been isolated from the international community, began to garner sympathy from various countries, particularly in Europe. The Boer republics, especially the Transvaal, appealed to the international community for support in their struggle against British imperialism. Several European nations, including Germany and France, expressed solidarity with the Boers, viewing the British Empire's actions as part of a larger trend of imperialist expansion. The Boer cause was seen as a struggle for independence, and many European intellectuals and political figures spoke out in support of the Boers. In the United States, the Boer War also captured the imagination of many, especially those who sympathized with the Boers' fight for freedom against British colonialism. American newspapers published stories about the war, and there were widespread debates about the ethics of British conduct, particularly regarding the use of concentration camps and the treatment of Boer civilians. While the United States remained officially neutral, public opinion was largely sympathetic toward the Boer cause. Many Americans saw parallels between the Boer struggle and their own Revolutionary War, viewing the conflict as a David and Goliath battle between a small, determined people and a global empire. On the British side, the war also sparked a great deal of public debate. The British government, led by Prime Minister Lord Salisbury and later by Arthur Balfour, faced criticism from various sectors of British society. Many in Britain questioned the necessity of the war and the heavy toll it was taking on British troops and resources. The prolonged conflict led to increasing anti-war sentiment in Britain, with protests and demonstrations against the war becoming more common. British media outlets, particularly those aligned with the anti-imperialist movement, published stories highlighting the brutality of British tactics, including the use of concentration camps, and criticized the government for failing to secure a quick victory. However, the British government was determined to win the war, believing that British prestige and the stability of the empire were at stake. The British military, bolstered by reinforcements from colonies across the British Empire, continued its efforts to suppress the Boer resistance. Despite growing opposition at home and abroad, the British government remained committed to defeating the Boers and bringing the war to a conclusion, no matter the cost. As the Boer guerrilla tactics persisted and the war of attrition continued, the British employed increasingly harsh measures in an attempt to break the Boer resistance. The British forces, now under the leadership of Lord Kitchener, adopted a strategy of attrition designed to exhaust the Boers' resources and manpower. This strategy involved cutting off the Boer forces from their supplies and support bases, while simultaneously targeting Boer civilian populations in an effort to deprive them of the means to continue the fight. One of the most notorious aspects of the strategy was the scorched earth policy, which aimed to destroy anything that could be of use to the Boer forces. British troops systematically burned Boer farms, slaughtered livestock, and destroyed infrastructure, leaving entire regions desolate. This tactic was intended to deprive the Boers of food and shelter, forcing them to surrender or face starvation. However, the policy had devastating consequences for the Boer civilian population, many of whom were left homeless and without means of sustenance. In addition to the scorched earth policy, the British also began to round up Boer civilians and place them in concentration camps. These camps, originally intended as a way to protect Boer civilians from the conflict, became infamous for their overcrowding, poor sanitation, and inadequate food supplies. Thousands of Boer women and children died from disease and malnutrition while held in the camps. The brutality of the British tactics in these camps sparked outrage, both within the British Empire and internationally. The use of concentration camps was one of the most controversial aspects of the war, and it contributed to the growing anti-war sentiment in Britain and abroad. Despite the widespread suffering inflicted on the Boer population, the British strategy of attrition was beginning to show results. The Boer forces, though still determined, were increasingly unable to maintain their resistance. The British military, despite their difficulties with guerrilla warfare, had succeeded in undermining the Boers' logistical capabilities and morale. By mid-1902, the Boer forces were exhausted, and the war had taken a heavy toll on both sides. The Boer republics, particularly the Transvaal and Orange Free State, had been devastated by the British military campaign, and their leadership recognized that continuing the war was no longer sustainable. The Boer leaders, including President Paul Kruger of the Transvaal, began to explore the possibility of negotiating a peace settlement with the British. Negotiations began in earnest in early 1902, with both sides realizing that further fighting would only prolong the suffering of civilians and soldiers alike. The British, though determined to secure a definitive victory, were also keen to bring an end to the war, which had drained resources and tarnished Britain's reputation internationally. The Boer leadership, led by generals such as Louis Botha and Jan Smuts, understood that they could not continue fighting indefinitely and that a negotiated settlement might offer the best chance for preserving some degree of Boer autonomy. The peace talks culminated in the signing of the Treaty of Vereniging on May 31st, 1902, which officially ended the Anglo-Boer War. The treaty recognized British sovereignty over the Transvaal and the Orange Free State, but it also provided for certain concessions to the Boers, including amnesty for Boer fighters and the protection of their property rights. The Boers were allowed to retain their language, Dutch, and certain cultural practices, and the British promised to invest in the reconstruction of the Boer republics. While the treaty marked the official end of the war, it was a bittersweet victory for both sides. The British had achieved their imperial objectives, but the cost of the war had been immense, both in terms of lives lost and the damage done to British prestige. For the Boers, the war had been a costly struggle for independence, and although they had lost the battle, they remained a powerful force in southern African politics. The end of the war marked the beginning of a new era for South Africa, which would eventually see the establishment of the Union of South Africa in 1910 under British dominion, but with significant political influence retained by the Afrikaners, many of whom had been involved in the Boer War. The signing of the Treaty of Vereniging in 1902, which ended the Anglo-Boer War, brought an official conclusion to the conflict but left a lasting legacy on the Boer republics. The political and economic consequences for the Boers were significant, as they had to navigate their new status within the British Empire while attempting to preserve their culture and way of life. Despite the Boers' loss in the war, they still retained a sense of pride in their resistance to British imperialism. Many Boer leaders, including Louis Botha and Jan Smuts, emerged from the war with elevated status, and their political influence would play a major role in shaping the future of South Africa. Under the terms of the treaty, the British took full control of the Transvaal and the Orange Free State, but the Boers were granted certain political rights. Dutch and Afrikaans were recognized as official languages, and the Boer elite was allowed to retain political power within the new political system. This meant that, while South Africa was now a British colony, the Boers were granted a level of autonomy in the new union that would allow them to maintain significant influence over national affairs. Economically, the Boers faced immense challenges. The war had devastated much of the countryside, with farms, livestock, and infrastructure destroyed during the British Scorched Earth campaign. The Boer civilian population had suffered greatly from the destruction and the harsh conditions of the British concentration camps, and many families were left with little more than the rubble of their former homes. The war had also led to the loss of thousands of Boer lives, which impacted the labor force and economic productivity. In the years following the war, the British government promised substantial reconstruction aid to help rebuild the Boer republics. However, many Boer families struggled to recover from the war's economic impact, particularly as their former agricultural enterprises had been decimated. Despite the economic hardships, the Boers began to rebuild their lives, with many turning to the mining industry for opportunities. The discovery of gold and diamonds had played a major role in the British desire to control the region, and the Boers began to capitalize on these industries, although they remained at the mercy of British investors and foreign capital. While the Treaty of Vereniging provided a degree of political autonomy to the Boers, it also set the stage for the rise of Afrikaner nationalism in South Africa. The sense of pride in the Boer struggle against British imperialism, combined with the desire to restore Boer economic and political dominance, laid the groundwork for the development of a unique Afrikaner identity. The Boer War had been seen as a struggle for survival and independence, and this struggle became a central theme in the narrative of Afrikaner history. Afrikaner nationalism grew as the Boer population sought to preserve their cultural heritage and resist the influences of British colonialism. A key part of this movement was the development of a distinct Afrikaner identity, centered around the Dutch language, Calvinist Protestantism, and the Boer military experience. The Boer War had created a sense of unity among the Boers, who viewed themselves as the true inheritors of South Africa's land and history. The term Afrikaner came to represent not just the descendants of Dutch settlers, but also the white, predominantly Dutch-speaking population who identified with the Boer struggle. In the years following the war, Afrikaner nationalism began to gain traction in both the political and cultural spheres. Political organizations, such as the South African Party and the more conservative National Party, began to represent the interests of the Afrikaner people. These political movements were driven by the desire to protect the rights of the Boers and to ensure that their influence over South African politics and society was preserved. While the British had nominally won the war, the Afrikaners had emerged from it with a powerful sense of national identity and political will, setting the stage for the eventual establishment of apartheid in the 20th century. One of the most significant milestones in the development of Afrikaner nationalism was the rise of Boer War heroes like Louis Botha and Jan Smuts, who would later play crucial roles in South African politics. Botha became the first Prime Minister of the Union of South Africa, and Smuts would go on to become one of the country's most prominent leaders, serving as Prime Minister and representing South Africa on the international stage. Botha and Smuts, who had been key figures in the Boer resistance during the war, sought to balance Boer interests with the need for unity within a multiracial, post-war South Africa. The aftermath of the Anglo-Boer War also had significant consequences for British imperialism and the future of the British Empire in Southern Africa. While the British achieved their goal of incorporating the Boer republics into the empire, the cost of the war was high, both in terms of human lives and financial resources. The British Empire, which had been at the height of its power during the late 19th century, was shaken by the Boer War, as the conflict exposed vulnerabilities in its military and colonial strategy. The war led to widespread criticism of British imperial policies, both in Britain and abroad. The treatment of Boer civilians in the concentration camps, where tens of thousands of women and children died from disease and malnutrition, sparked outrage among international communities. British imperialists faced increasing opposition from anti-imperialist groups and liberal voices, who condemned the brutal tactics employed during the war. The war was also viewed by some as an unnecessary and costly venture driven by British economic interests, particularly the desire to control the gold and diamond resources of the Boer republics. The British government's handling of the war also had long-term effects on the relationship between Britain and its colonies. Although the British had won the Boer War marked the beginning of a shift in the British Empire's approach to its colonies. The heavy toll of the war and the growing calls for self-determination in the colonies would later contribute to the push for greater autonomy within the British Empire. The Boer War revealed the limits of British imperial power and highlighted the difficulty of maintaining control over far-flung colonies populated by determined, resistant populations. Furthermore, the Boer War significantly weakened British influence in Southern Africa. The British had expected to consolidate their control over the region quickly and decisively, but instead, they were faced with a growing sense of Afrikaner nationalism that would challenge British authority for decades to come. The British, despite their victory, had to contend with an increasingly assertive Afrikaner population that viewed the war as a rallying point for the fight for independence and self-rule. The impact of the war on British imperialism was felt not only in South Africa, but across the empire. The Boer War marked the last of the major colonial wars of the 19th century, and it set the stage for the decline of traditional imperialism in the 20th century. The British Empire would continue to face challenges in maintaining its global influence, and the Boer War would be remembered as a significant turning point in the history of colonialism. The end of the Anglo-Boer War did not mark the end of the Boers' political struggles. Instead, it paved the way for a new chapter in South African history, the formation of the Union of South Africa in 1910. The creation of a union was a result of negotiations between the British and the Boers, who sought to build a united country that could resist the challenges of both internal divisions and external pressures. The British government had long hoped for a united South Africa, where British and Boer interests could be balanced and the region could become a stable part of the British Empire. The Boer leaders, on the other hand, sought a political structure that would allow them to retain a significant amount of control over their own affairs. After years of negotiation and compromise, the British agreed to a system in which the Boers would have control over the new government, but British imperial interests would still be maintained in certain areas. The Union of South Africa was formed in 1910 under the South Africa Act, which united the previously separate colonies of the Cape Colony, Natal, the Transvaal, and the Orange Free State into one nation. The Boers, represented by their leaders, including Louis Botha, were able to secure significant political power within the new union. Botha, a prominent Boer general during the war, became the first Prime Minister of South Africa, and he worked to ensure that the Union's government would reflect Boer interests. While the Union of South Africa was a major victory for the Boers, it also created a deeply divided society. The political system of the Union was built on racial segregation, and while the Boers retained control of the government, the rights of non-white South Africans were severely restricted. The foundation of apartheid, a policy of racial segregation and discrimination that would be fully implemented in the 1940s, was laid in this period. Despite the political and economic gains made by the Boers, the question of race would continue to dominate South African politics for decades to come. With the establishment of the Union of South Africa, the political landscape of the country began to shift. The Boers, under the leadership of the Afrikaner National Party, which was formed in 1914, began to assert their dominance over South African politics. The Afrikaner National Party represented the interests of the Afrikaner people, many of whom had fought in the Anglo-Boer War and were determined to preserve their cultural and political power. The party's main goal was to ensure that the Afrikaners remained the dominant political force in the new nation. The Afrikaner National Party was able to consolidate its political power by appealing to the sense of Afrikaner nationalism that had grown out of the Boer War. The party emphasized the importance of preserving the Dutch language, Afrikaner culture, and Boer values. Over time, it gained support among the white population, particularly in the rural areas where Afrikaners had historically lived. The party's success was also facilitated by the political system of the Union, which was structured in such a way that the Afrikaners were able to maintain control of key political positions. One of the key issues faced by the Afrikaners in the Union was the question of how to deal with a non-white population, which made up the majority of South Africa's population. While the British had maintained a policy of racial segregation in certain areas, the Boers were more focused on ensuring that the rights of white South Africans, particularly Afrikaners, were protected. The Boer leadership was determined to prevent the expansion of political rights for non-white South Africans, and they used their political power in the Union to pass legislation that restricted the rights of black, colored, and Indian South Africans. The foundations of apartheid were established during this period, even though the official policy would not be fully implemented until the 1940s. The racial policies introduced by the Afrikaner National Party would continue to shape South African politics for much of the 20th century, and the legacy of the Boer War, with its emphasis on Afrikaner nationalism and racial segregation, would have a profound impact on the future of the country. In the years following the formation of the Union of South Africa in 1910, Afrikaner nationalism began to take shape as a dominant political force. The Boer War had fostered a strong sense of pride and identity among the Afrikaner people, many of whom viewed the conflict as a heroic struggle for survival against British imperialism. This sense of nationalism continued to grow, fueled by the belief that the Boers had triumphed against overwhelming odds. The Boer War experience became central to Afrikaner identity, and this collective memory was used to justify political actions and policies aimed at preserving Afrikaner culture and values in the face of growing British influence in the Union. Afrikaner nationalism was further bolstered by economic and social changes in South Africa. The country was rapidly industrializing, particularly in the mining sector, which was dominated by British capital and foreign investment. Many Afrikaners, particularly in rural areas, felt marginalized in this new economy. The British-controlled economy often left Afrikaners struggling to gain access to economic opportunities, particularly in urban centers where British influence was most pronounced. This economic alienation created a fertile ground for political movements that promised to return power to the Afrikaners and restore their cultural and economic dominance. The establishment of the Afrikaner National Party in 1914 marked a key turning point in the political landscape of South Africa. The party, led by figures such as J.B.M. Hertzog, sought to challenge British influence in the Union and ensure that the Afrikaners remained in control of South African politics. Hertzog and his allies emphasized the need for a distinctly Afrikaner approach to governance, one that prioritized the interests of the white Boer population. This party would eventually become the driving force behind the implementation of apartheid policies, which aimed to institutionalize racial segregation and elevate the status of the Afrikaner people. By the 1920s, the Afrikaner National Party had gained significant political traction, particularly in the rural areas where the majority of Afrikaners lived. The party's platform focused on promoting Afrikaner unity, preserving Afrikaner cultural traditions, and ensuring that political power remained in the hands of the Afrikaner people. As a result, the Afrikaner National Party began to position itself as the voice of the Afrikaner working class, which felt increasingly alienated from the economic power held by the British and other European settlers in the country. The economic policies that shaped the Union of South Africa after 1910 laid the groundwork for the eventual implementation of apartheid. As South Africa transitioned from a predominantly agricultural economy to one dominated by mining and industry, significant changes took place in the distribution of wealth and power. The mining sector, particularly in gold and diamonds, attracted substantial foreign investment, much of it from British and other international capitalists. This development led to a concentration of economic power in the hands of a few wealthy business interests, often with ties to the British Empire. In contrast, the majority of the white Afrikaner population, especially those in rural areas, faced economic difficulties. The Afrikaners, many of whom were descendants of the original Dutch settlers, had been historically marginalized in terms of access to economic opportunities, particularly in comparison to British settlers, who had established control over many of the country's most lucrative industries. The Boer War had also caused widespread economic destruction, and the Afrikaner population was still struggling to rebuild its agricultural base after the devastation of the conflict. In response to these economic inequalities, Afrikaner nationalist movements began to advocate for policies that would benefit the Afrikaner population and limit the power of foreign capital. One of the key goals of these movements was to provide Afrikaners with greater access to economic opportunities, particularly in the mining sector. These movements emphasized the need for an economic system that prioritized the interests of the Afrikaner people and ensured that Afrikaner businesses could thrive alongside the established British and foreign-owned enterprises. Simultaneously, the rising Afrikaner nationalist movements sought to protect their cultural identity, particularly from the influence of British colonialism. The rise of English as the dominant language of business and politics was seen as a direct challenge to Afrikaner traditions. Afrikaners began to view the preservation of their language, culture, and values as integral to maintaining their position in South African society. The establishment of Afrikaans as an official language alongside English in 1925 was one of the early victories for Afrikaner nationalists, signaling their increasing influence in the political landscape of South Africa. The economic and social challenges faced by Afrikaners in the early 20th century led to the development of policies that would later form the basis of apartheid. While early policies focused on economic self-sufficiency and the promotion of Afrikaner culture, they also sought to entrench racial segregation, particularly in the workplace. Afrikaner nationalists saw racial segregation as a means of ensuring that white South Africans, particularly Afrikaners, had access to jobs and economic opportunities that were not available to the black population. This mindset would evolve into the more rigid and institutionalized system of apartheid in the decades to come. The Great Depression in the 1930s had a profound impact on the political and economic landscape of South Africa, particularly in relation to Afrikaner politics. As the global economic downturn caused widespread unemployment and economic hardship, many Afrikaners, who were already struggling economically, were hit hard by the collapse of agricultural and industrial markets. The Depression exacerbated existing social and economic disparities between the Afrikaner population and the more affluent British settlers, who were more integrated into the global economy. The economic hardship caused by the Depression led to growing discontent among Afrikaners, who began to seek greater political representation and economic opportunity. The Afrikaner National Party, under the leadership of J.B.M. Hertzog, gained increasing support as it promised to address the economic concerns of Afrikaners and challenge the power of British and foreign capital. Herzog's platform focused on economic protectionism, arguing that South Africa's economy should be more self-sufficient and less reliant on foreign investment. At the same time, the National Party began to adopt more explicitly racial policies, advocating for the separation of races in all aspects of South African life. While the concept of apartheid was not fully articulated at this time, the ideas of racial segregation and the protection of Afrikaner interests were central to the party's platform. Herzog's government introduced policies that sought to limit the influence of black South Africans in the economy and restrict their access to certain jobs and industries. These policies were designed to create a system in which Afrikaners could maintain their dominance over the South African economy and political system. The economic crisis of the 1930s also led to greater cooperation between Afrikaner nationalist groups and the broader white South African establishment. The United Party, led by Jan Smuts, was the dominant political force at the time, but it was increasingly seen as too aligned with British interests and too liberal in its approach to racial issues. As the Afrikaner National Party gained traction, Smuts' government became more concerned about the rising influence of Afrikaner nationalism, which sought to replace the existing political order with one that reflected the priorities of the Afrikaner people. By the late 1930s, the National Party had become a powerful force in South African politics, and the ideas of apartheid and racial segregation began to take root. The economic challenges of the Great Depression had highlighted the need for Afrikaners to assert control over their economy and political system, and the party's increasing influence set the stage for the eventual implementation of full apartheid policies in the 1940s. The National Party's rise to power was a direct result of the economic and political discontent that many Afrikaners felt during this period, and it marked the beginning of a new era in South African history. The year 1948 marked a pivotal moment in South African history with the electoral victory of the National Party, led by Daniel Francois Mallon, which ushered in the official system of apartheid. In the 1948 general elections, the National Party won a narrow victory, marking the culmination of decades of Afrikaner nationalism and the increasing discontent among Afrikaners with the existing political system. The election victory signified not just a shift in political power, but the birth of a new era in South African governance, one that would enshrine racial segregation as a state policy. The National Party's rise to power was fueled by the growing influence of Afrikaner nationalism, which had gained momentum throughout the early 20th century, especially in response to British imperialism, the aftermath of the Boer War, and the economic hardships caused by the Great Depression. The party's platform was built on the promise of restoring Afrikaner dignity, culture, and political power in a country that had been dominated by British interests and economic influence. In their campaign, they appealed to the Afrikaner working class and rural population, who felt alienated from the economically powerful British settlers and the increasingly industrialized urban economy. The victory of the National Party came as a result of its ability to unite various Afrikaner factions, including the more conservative elements who sought a return to traditional values and the more progressive factions that advocated for economic protectionism. The party's message resonated with many South Africans who felt that the country's political system was not serving their needs. While the National Party campaigned on the promise of better governance for the white population, particularly Afrikaners, they also heavily emphasized the need for strict racial segregation as a means of preserving Afrikaner identity and economic stability. The National Party's victory was also facilitated by the weakening of the United Party, which had been the dominant political force in South Africa since the formation of the Union in 1910. The United Party, under Jan Smuts, had been associated with the liberal, pro-British policies that many Afrikaners resented. Smuts' position on racial issues, while more moderate than the national parties, was still seen as too conciliatory towards the non-white population. The National Party capitalized on this, promising a new approach to governance that would prioritize the interests of white South Africans, particularly those of Afrikaners, and implement policies of racial separation. In the aftermath of the 1948 election, the National Party quickly set to work implementing its vision for South Africa, using its mandate to begin formally institutionalizing apartheid as state policy. This shift marked a drastic departure from previous political systems and set the stage for a series of laws that would come to define South African society for decades. Upon taking power in 1948, the National Party wasted no time in implementing the legal framework for apartheid, an ideology based on the premise of racial segregation and white supremacy. The first major piece of legislation was the Population Registration Act of 1950, which established the classification of all South Africans into racial categories. These categories included white, black, colored, and Indian, with each group assigned different legal rights and responsibilities based on its classification. The act was fundamental to the apartheid system, as it created a legal structure for racial discrimination and determined which areas of life individuals could participate in based on their racial classification. Following this, the Group Areas Act of 1950 was passed, which divided South Africa into designated areas where different racial groups could live, work, and own property. This law forcibly removed non-white South Africans from areas that were deemed white only and resettled them in townships or homelands, often located far from urban centers and economic opportunities. In essence, this policy sought to maintain white dominance in cities and towns by segregating black South Africans from both the economic power and the political influence that was concentrated in the urban areas. One of the most significant pieces of legislation passed under apartheid was the Bantu Education Act of 1953. This law aimed to provide a separate and unequal educational system for black South Africans, designed to keep them in subservient roles within the economy. The Bantu Education Act institutionalized the idea that black South Africans were destined to be manual laborers, farmers, or servants, and that they did not need the same level of education as white South Africans. The education system was designed to reinforce racial inequalities, ensuring that black South Africans would remain in economically and politically subordinate positions. The passed laws were another crucial aspect of apartheid, which severely restricted the movement of black South Africans. Under these laws, black South Africans were required to carry a passbook that recorded their personal details, employment, and permission to be in certain areas. These laws were a means of controlling the labor force, ensuring that black South Africans could only work in designated sectors and that they were kept from urban areas without permission. The passed laws became a symbol of the constant surveillance and control that defined life under apartheid. The National Party's strategy was clear: to ensure the continued dominance of the white minority, particularly the Afrikaner population, by legally entrenching racial segregation and by systematically depriving non-white South Africans of their rights. These laws created a rigid social hierarchy in which whites were at the top, followed by a racially defined underclass, and the non-white population was relegated to the lowest positions in society. The legal framework of apartheid would continue to expand over the next few decades, reinforcing racial divisions in every aspect of life, from the workplace to the education system, and from the economy to the very structure of the family. The apartheid system in South Africa quickly drew the attention of the international community, which began to strongly condemn the policies of racial segregation and discrimination. Many countries, particularly in the newly formed United Nations, viewed apartheid as a violation of human rights and an affront to the principles of equality and justice. However, despite the widespread international condemnation, South Africa's government remained defiant, using its control over the media and its strong military and police forces to silence opposition and maintain the status quo. In the early years of apartheid, South Africa faced increasing diplomatic isolation. The United Nations and other international bodies condemned the country's racial policies, and in 1949, the UN General Assembly passed a resolution calling for the ending of racial discrimination in South Africa. In 1961, South Africa was suspended from the Commonwealth of Nations due to its policies of racial segregation. This suspension marked a significant shift in South Africa's international standing, and it highlighted the growing global movement against colonialism and racial oppression. Despite the international pressure, the National Party remained steadfast in its commitment to apartheid. Domestically, however, the resistance to apartheid began to grow, particularly from the black South African population, which had been subject to the worst excesses of the apartheid system. The African National Congress, ANC, led by figures like Nelson Mandela, became the focal point of the struggle against apartheid. In the 1950s and 1960s, the ANC organized protests, strikes, and acts of civil disobedience to challenge the government's policies. The ANC was initially focused on nonviolent resistance, but as the government intensified its repression, the movement adopted more radical tactics. In 1961, after the Sharpeville massacre, where police killed 69 peaceful protesters, the ANC decided to form an armed wing, Umkhonto we Sizwe, MK, to carry out acts of sabotage against government targets. The shift to armed resistance signaled a new phase in the struggle against apartheid, which would ultimately culminate in a long and brutal fight for liberation. Internationally, the anti-apartheid movement gained momentum, with boycotts, sanctions, and protests spreading across the globe. Key organizations, such as the International Trade Union Confederation, and prominent political figures, including Martin Luther King Jr. and former U.S. President Jimmy Carter, lent their voices to the cause. Anti-apartheid activists and organizations, including the ANC, the Pan-Africanist Congress, PAC, and the South African Communist Party, SACP, forge alliances with global movements fighting for civil rights and decolonization, bringing greater attention to South Africa's repressive policies. The resistance within South Africa and the growing international pressure eventually led to the weakening of apartheid. While the National Party remained in power for several decades, the global community's commitment to economic sanctions and political isolation, coupled with domestic unrest, forced the government to consider eventual reforms. The years following the 1960s saw an intensification of the struggle, with both violent and nonviolent actions shaping the eventual fall of apartheid in the 1990s. The Sharpeville massacre, which occurred on March 21st, 1960, was one of the most pivotal moments in the history of the anti-apartheid struggle. This event galvanized both domestic and international opposition to the apartheid regime. Sharpeville, a township in the Vaal Triangle, was the site of a peaceful protest organized by the African National Congress, ANC, and Pan-Africanist Congress, PAC, against the apartheid pass laws, which required black South Africans to carry passbooks that restricted their movement and employment. The protest aimed to challenge the pass law system by encouraging people to deliberately break the law and present themselves for arrest. On that fateful day, approximately 5,000 people gathered in front of the Sharpeville police station to peacefully protest. The situation quickly escalated as police surrounded the crowd and tensions mounted. What followed was one of the deadliest instances of police brutality in South Africa's history. Without warning, the police opened fire on the unarmed crowd, killing 69 people, including women and children, and injuring over 180 others. Most of the victims were shot in the back as they fled from the police gunfire. The Sharpeville massacre shocked the world and exposed the brutal reality of the apartheid regime. The response from the international community was swift and condemnatory. The United Nations condemned the killings, and many countries around the world imposed sanctions or began to boycott South African goods. This international outrage marked a turning point in the struggle against apartheid. Domestically, the massacre led to an intensification of resistance efforts, particularly among black South Africans and their allies. The massacre also served as a critical moment for the ANC and other anti-apartheid organizations. who realized that peaceful resistance was unlikely to bring about change while the apartheid state remained entrenched in power. Following the massacre, the South African government banned the ANC and PAC, forcing both organizations to go underground. Many of the leading figures of the ANC, including Nelson Mandela, were arrested or went into hiding. The events at Sharpeville demonstrated the lengths to which the apartheid regime would go to maintain control, and it made clear that the struggle for equality and justice would require far more than passive resistance. In response to the Sharpeville massacre and the growing realization that peaceful protests alone would not dismantle apartheid, the African National Congress, ANC, made the historic decision to form an armed wing, Umkhonto weSizwe, MK, in 1961. MK, which translates to Spear of the Nation, was established under the leadership of Nelson Mandela and other prominent ANC leaders, such as Walter Sisulu and Joe Slovo. The formation of MK marked a fundamental shift in the ANC's strategy, as it now embraced armed struggle as a legitimate means of resistance against the apartheid state. The decision to turn to armed resistance was not taken lightly. For years, the ANC had relied on peaceful protests, strikes, and civil disobedience as its primary methods of resistance. However, after the Sharpeville massacre, it became apparent that the apartheid regime would not respond to peaceful methods. The ANC and its allies recognized that the time had come for direct action against the regime, using sabotage and guerrilla tactics to weaken the government's control. MK's first acts of sabotage were directed at government infrastructure, including railways, power stations, and military installations. The idea behind these early operations was to disrupt the functioning of the apartheid state without causing loss of life. MK's campaign of sabotage, known as the armed struggle, was aimed at destabilizing the regime and sending a clear message that the ANC would no longer accept apartheid's oppressive system. While the MK's efforts were modest at first, they represented a significant escalation in the resistance movement and marked the beginning of a long and violent confrontation between the apartheid state and those fighting for freedom. The armed struggle also led to greater international attention and support for the ANC. As MK carried out more attacks, the apartheid regime responded with increased repression, including arrests, torture, and executions of resistance fighters. At the same time, the ANC, through its armed struggle and underground activities, began to draw greater sympathy from the international community, particularly from countries and movements fighting for independence and against colonial rule. Anti-apartheid movements around the world began to intensify, and MK's actions were seen as part of a larger struggle against the tyranny of apartheid. In 1962, Nelson Mandela, who had been underground for several years, was arrested by the apartheid authorities. His capture was part of a broader crackdown by the South African government against anti-apartheid leaders and organizations. Mandela's arrest was the result of the government's surveillance of ANC activities and their increasing focus on dismantling the underground resistance. After being captured, Mandela, along with other ANC leaders, was put on trial in 1963 for his role in organizing acts of sabotage against the government. The trial, known as the Rivonia Trial, took place in 1963 to 1964 and became a defining moment in the anti-apartheid movement. The trial was named after Rivonia, a suburb in Johannesburg where many of the ANC's leaders, including Mandela, had been arrested. The government charged Mandela and his co-defendants with sabotage and attempting to overthrow the state. The prosecution sought the death penalty, but Mandela and his fellow accused chose to defend their actions publicly, using the trial as an opportunity to speak out against apartheid and its oppressive policies. During his defense speech, Mandela delivered a powerful statement in which he explained that he had fought against white domination and had also fought for the equality of all people, regardless of their race. He famously concluded his speech with the words, "I have fought against white domination, and I have fought against black domination. I have cherished the ideal of a democratic and free society in which all persons live together in harmony and with equal opportunities. It is an ideal which I hope to live for and to achieve. But if needs be, is an ideal for which I am prepared to die." Mandela's words resonated around the world and turned the Rivonia trial into a symbol of resistance against apartheid. Despite the courage and clarity with which he spoke, the trial resulted in a guilty verdict for Mandela and 7 other defendants. Mandela was sentenced to life imprisonment, along with his co-accused, who included prominent ANC leaders like Walter Sisulu and Govan Mbeki. Mandela was sent to the notorious Robben Island prison, where he would spend the next 18 years of his life. The Rivonia trial and Mandela's imprisonment galvanized the anti-apartheid movement, both inside and outside South Africa, and it became clear that the struggle against apartheid was not only a matter of national importance, but had become a global cause. Mandela's imprisonment turned him into a symbol of resistance. The call for his release became one of the central rallying points for anti-apartheid activists worldwide. His incarceration and the conditions under which he and his fellow prisoners were held further exposed the brutality of the apartheid regime and highlighted the lengths to which the government was willing to go to maintain its control. Mandela's imprisonment also served to unite anti-apartheid forces around the world, leading to growing calls for international sanctions, divestment from South Africa, and boycotts of South African products. Mandela's steadfast commitment to the struggle, even behind bars, helped to keep the flame of resistance alive and strengthen the resolve of those fighting against apartheid. The imprisonment of Nelson Mandela and the ongoing brutality of the apartheid regime in South Africa sparked widespread international condemnation and led to the growth of a global anti-apartheid movement. The international community, led by governments, civil society groups, and grassroots movements, began to mobilize against the apartheid state through various means of protest, economic sanctions, and boycotts. The struggle against apartheid became a rallying cry for freedom and human rights across the globe, and South Africa's racial policies were increasingly seen as a violation of international law and human dignity. One of the most significant efforts to isolate South Africa internationally was the campaign for economic sanctions. Beginning in the 1960s and intensifying in the 1980s, countries, especially in Europe and North America, implemented sanctions against South Africa in an attempt to force the apartheid regime to change. These sanctions included bans on trade in goods and services, restrictions on investments, and the cessation of cultural and academic exchanges. The United Nations, in particular, played a central role in mobilizing international support for the anti-apartheid cause. In 1962, the UN General Assembly called for a voluntary arms embargo against South Africa, which was followed by a series of resolutions condemning apartheid. The campaign for sanctions was supported by a growing number of people and organizations worldwide, including trade unions, churches, political activists, and student groups. The boycott of South African goods was one of the key tactics employed by anti-apartheid activists. Protesters across the world targeted South African products, including wine, fruit, and minerals, to reduce the economic power of the apartheid regime. The divestment movement, which called for the withdrawal of investment from companies doing business with South Africa, also gained momentum. These efforts were instrumental in applying pressure on the South African government to reconsider its policies. At the same time, cultural and sporting boycotts played a critical role in isolating South Africa. The country was banned from participating in international sporting events, including the Olympic Games and the FIFA World Cup, as well as cultural exchanges. The boycott of South African athletes and performers was part of the broader global effort to denounce apartheid and show solidarity with the people of South Africa. While global solidarity grew, the response from Western governments, particularly the United States and the United Kingdom, was more complex. Initially, both the US and the UK were reluctant to impose harsh sanctions on South Africa due to strategic, economic, and political considerations. South Africa's importance as a trading partner, particularly in the context of the Cold War, influenced their approach to the apartheid regime. In the United States, while there was significant grassroots opposition to apartheid, the government of the time, led by President Ronald Reagan in the 1980s, was slow to act. Reagan's administration resisted calls for economic sanctions and continued to engage with the South African government diplomatically. In contrast, public opinion in the U.S. and political movements, such as the anti-apartheid movement, AM, and student-led divestment campaigns, pushed for tougher action. The struggle for divestment was one of the central strategies to challenge U.S. corporate involvement in South Africa. By the mid-1980s, U.S. states and cities had begun to pass laws demanding that pension funds and public investments be withdrawn from companies operating in South Africa. Despite opposition from Reagan's administration, in 1986, Congress passed the Comprehensive Anti-Apartheid Act, which imposed sanctions on South Africa, marking a significant shift in U.S. policy. Similarly, the United Kingdom, while condemning apartheid publicly, maintained significant economic ties with South Africa, particularly in trade and investment. Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, who was in power during much of the 1980s, argued against the imposition of sanctions, favoring constructive engagement with the South African government. However, public pressure from anti-apartheid groups, including organizations like the anti-apartheid movement and civil society activists, eventually led to a shift in British policy. The Labour Party and trade unions played a significant role in pushing for stronger action against the apartheid regime. The 1980s saw the intensification of anti-apartheid protests across the globe, particularly in Europe, the US, and even within South Africa itself. Large-scale demonstrations, often involving students, trade unions, and political activists, took place in major cities, with participants calling for the immediate release of Nelson Mandela, the end of apartheid, and sanctions against South Africa. These protests became a significant part of the global movement that kept pressure on the South African government. In the United States, universities were at the forefront of the divestment campaign, with student groups organizing to demand that their schools divest from companies that did business in South Africa. By the end of the decade, hundreds of universities, cities, and states had divested from companies with links to South Africa. The divestment campaign was widely seen as one of the most successful grassroots movements in modern history, showing the power of coordinated global action. In the UK, the anti-apartheid movement continued to grow in strength, organizing protests, cultural events, and boycotts to raise awareness of apartheid. The campaign to secure the release of Nelson Mandela, coupled with international economic and cultural sanctions, began to have a visible impact on the apartheid regime as the government became increasingly isolated from the international community. These widespread protests, combined with the economic sanctions, left the apartheid government in an increasingly untenable position. By the late 1980s, the South African economy was suffering from the effects of sanctions and internal unrest. Public support for apartheid was waning, both domestically and abroad, and many within the ruling government began to recognize the need for change. The global solidarity and efforts of the anti-apartheid movement were critical in bringing about the eventual dismantling of the apartheid system and the liberation of Nelson Mandela. By the late 1980s, apartheid South Africa was in the midst of a profound crisis. The country's economy, once thriving due to its rich mineral resources, was now reeling from the effects of international sanctions, divestment campaigns, and internal unrest. The apartheid government had long relied on its strategic importance in the Cold War as a reason for continued Western support, but by the late 1980s, this was no longer enough to secure international backing. The United States, United Kingdom, and many other countries had implemented harsh economic sanctions, and South African businesses found themselves increasingly isolated from global markets. The banking sector, in particular, struggled as global financial institutions pulled out their investments, sending the South African economy into a tailspin. In addition to international pressures, internal unrest was reaching a fever pitch. The African National Congress, ANC, and other resistance movements, such as the Pan-Africanist Congress, PAC, and the South African Communist Party, SACP, had continued their efforts to destabilize the apartheid state. The government responded with brutal force, attempting to crush opposition through violent repression, including mass arrests, torture, and killings. Thousands of political activists, trade unionists, and ordinary citizens were caught in the crossfire of the government's crackdown on resistance. The internal resistance was most evident in the growing urban uprisings and rural revolts. Townships like Soweto and Khayelitsha, where millions of black South Africans were forced to live under apartheid, became hotbeds of unrest. Riots, protests, and strikes became common occurrences as young people and workers increasingly challenged the legitimacy of apartheid. These uprisings were met with military force, but they highlighted the deepening crisis faced by the apartheid regime. South Africa's political and social fabric was unraveling, and the once unquestioned dominance of the white minority was being eroded. While the economic sanctions and internal resistance were powerful forces in weakening the apartheid state, it was clear that no amount of force would be enough to quell the demands for change. The South African government, facing an increasingly untenable situation, began to realize that it could not continue to maintain apartheid without risking a complete collapse of the country. By the end of the 1980s, even hardline figures within the apartheid government, including President F.W. de Klerk, recognized the need for reform. In 1989, F.W. de Klerk became the president of South Africa, inheriting a deeply divided nation on the brink of collapse. De Klerk was initially known for his staunch defense of apartheid, but he soon became one of the key figures in the transition away from racial segregation. His leadership was pivotal in ending apartheid, as he began to recognize the necessity of reforming the country's political system to avoid total collapse. De Klerk's government faced enormous pressure from within and outside the country. The ANC had been banned since 1960, and its leaders, including Nelson Mandela, were incarcerated in prison. Despite the harsh measures of repression, the ANC, under its exiled leadership, had continued to play a central role in organizing resistance. The global sanctions, combined with intense domestic strife, made it clear that apartheid was no longer sustainable. Recognizing this, de Klerk began to take steps to open up negotiations with the ANC and other political organizations in the early 1990s. One of his first significant moves was the unbanning of the ANC and other political organizations that had been outlawed for decades. In February 1990, he announced the release of Nelson Mandela from prison after 27 years of incarceration. Mandela's release was a monumental event, not only in South African history, but in the global struggle for human rights. It marked the beginning of a new chapter in the country's history, as the ANC was now able to operate freely, and negotiations for a peaceful transition began in earnest. De Klerk's decision to release Mandela was not without risks. It represented a dramatic shift in policy for the National Party, which had long been the enforcer of apartheid. However, de Klerk understood that South Africa's future depended on ending apartheid peacefully, and he was willing to engage in negotiations with the ANC and other political groups to chart a path toward a more inclusive, democratic society. The decision to enter into negotiations with the ANC was also influenced by growing international pressure. Western countries had been calling for South Africa to end apartheid for decades, and the economic sanctions had begun to take a significant toll on the country's economy. Furthermore, the increasing popularity of Nelson Mandela as a symbol of resistance, both within South Africa and internationally, made it clear that any negotiated settlement would have to include the ANC and other liberation movements. The unbanning of political parties and Mandela's release were clear signals that South Africa was entering a new era, one where the principle of equality, however distant, was beginning to take root. Once Nelson Mandela was released in February 1990, the ANC moved quickly to establish itself as a legitimate political force in South Africa. Mandela was immediately thrust into the role of national leader and symbol of hope for millions of South Africans who had long fought against apartheid. However, Mandela, who had spent nearly 3 decades in prison, understood the complexities of negotiating a peaceful transition. He was committed to reconciliation, not vengeance, and aimed to ensure that the new South Africa would be a place of peace, justice, and equality for all its citizens, regardless of race. Mandela's release was followed by a series of high-level negotiations between the ANC and the National Party. The two sides came together in talks that would eventually lead to the dismantling of apartheid and the establishment of a democratic South Africa. The negotiations, which took place over several years, involved discussions on everything from the drafting of a new constitution to the establishment of transitional governments and the future role of the country's white minority. One of the most significant moments in these negotiations was the CODESA, Convention for a Democratic South Africa, talks, which were held between 1991 and 1993. These negotiations were aimed at reaching a consensus on a new democratic order that would end apartheid and pave the way for free elections in 1994. Both the ANC and the National Party, along with other political organizations, engaged in intense negotiations, often making painful compromises to ensure that a peaceful resolution could be achieved. At CODESA, the two sides discussed issues such as the protection of minority rights, the establishment of a non-racial democracy, and the potential role of the military in the transition process. One of the key outcomes of these talks was the decision to hold multiracial elections in 1994, marking the first time in South Africa's history that people of all races would be allowed to vote. The road to these elections was fraught with tension, including periodic violence and disagreements over specific terms of the negotiations, but the willingness of both sides to compromise was essential to the success of the process. Ultimately, in 1993, after years of tense negotiations, an agreement was reached, and the transition to a democratic South Africa became a reality. Nelson Mandela and F.W. de Klerk were jointly awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for their efforts in bringing peace to the country. The peaceful negotiations were a testament to the courage of the leaders involved and the commitment of both the ANC and the National Party to a peaceful resolution of the conflict was a turning point in the country's history. The successful conclusion of the negotiations laid the foundation for the 1994 democratic elections, which were a watershed moment for South Africa. Nelson Mandela, after decades of imprisonment and struggle, was elected as the country's first black president, and the era of apartheid officially came to an end. The first democratic elections in South Africa, held in April 1994, marked a monumental shift in the nation's history. For the first time, all South Africans, regardless of race, were granted the right to vote, a key moment in the country's long struggle to end apartheid. These elections were the culmination of decades of resistance, political negotiations, and global pressure against the apartheid regime. The election represented a moment of profound transformation, not only for South Africa, but for the entire world, as it marked the official end of racial segregation and the beginning of a new chapter of democracy and reconciliation. Leading up to the election, the country was filled with a mixture of hope, excitement, and tension. Although the transition from apartheid to democracy had been a relatively peaceful one compared to many other countries with similar histories of racial oppression, South Africa was still grappling with significant challenges. The deep divisions created by apartheid were still evident in the social and economic fabric of the country, and tensions were high as different groups, including political parties, business leaders, and civil society organizations, began to navigate this new, uncharted territory. For Nelson Mandela, the election was not just a political victory, but the culmination of a lifetime of struggle against apartheid. As the leader of the African National Congress, ANC, Mandela's candidacy was symbolic of the triumph of hope over oppression. However, the election also represented a critical test for the ANC, as it was not guaranteed that the party would win the support of all South Africans. While the majority of black South Africans supported the ANC's vision for a new South Africa, there were also concerns from white South Africans and some minority groups about the future of the country under a black majority government. The elections themselves were a logistical challenge. South Africa's election commission, under the leadership of a newly formed democratic government, had to ensure that millions of people, many of whom had been denied voting rights for generations, were able to register and cast their ballots. The country's infrastructure had to be rapidly adapted to accommodate a large voter turnout, and security was a concern as some groups, particularly the white minority factions and those who felt threatened by the political changes, attempted to disrupt the process. Nevertheless, the election process was largely peaceful, and the success of the election was a testament to the determination and resilience of the South African people. On Election Day, South Africa witnessed an outpouring of support for the ANC. The party received an overwhelming majority of the votes, winning 62.6% of the national vote and securing 252 of the 400 seats in parliament. The National Party, which had been the ruling party under apartheid, garnered only 20.4% of the vote. This was a significant shift, as it marked the formal end of the apartheid system, which had kept the white minority in power for decades. The ANC's victory was a powerful message of liberation, and it reaffirmed the popular will for a democratic, non-racial, and equal South Africa. Despite the ANC's victory, South Africa's future remained uncertain. The newly elected government, led by Nelson Mandela, faced enormous challenges. The country was still grappling with high levels of unemployment, poverty, and a legacy of deep racial and economic inequality. The nation also faced the task of rebuilding its institutions, fostering reconciliation between racial groups, and navigating the complex dynamics of a diverse society with a painful history. On May 10, 1994, Nelson Mandela was inaugurated as the first black president of South Africa, marking the official end of apartheid and the beginning of a new era. His election was not only a triumph for black South Africans, but also a victory for the ideals of democracy, justice, and reconciliation. Mandela's presidency represented a beacon of hope for a world that had long been divided along racial lines. His leadership style was characterized by a commitment to reconciliation and nation-building, as well as a deep understanding of the importance of forgiveness in moving the country forward. Mandela understood that South Africa's transition to democracy could not be built on vengeance or division. Having spent 27 years in prison, he knew the power of forgiveness, and upon his release in 1990, he called for reconciliation between the country's races. His goal was to unite the nation, heal its wounds, and create a government that was inclusive of all South Africans. Mandela's leadership style was grounded in the principles of inclusivity and consensus building. He worked tirelessly to ensure that all groups, including white South Africans, felt that their voices and interests were represented in the new democratic order. One of Mandela's first acts as president was to create the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, TRC, chaired by Archbishop Desmond Tutu. The TRC was established to investigate the human rights abuses committed during the apartheid era, providing a platform for victims to share their stories and for perpetrators to confess their crimes in exchange for amnesty. The TRC played a pivotal role in South Africa's transition by allowing the country to confront its dark past and work towards healing. It was based on the idea that truth-telling was an essential part of the process of national reconciliation, and that only through acknowledging the wrongs of the past could the country move forward. Mandela's approach to reconciliation was also reflected in his stance on the economic transformation of the country. Despite the ANC's victory, the economy was still highly unequal, with much of the country's wealth concentrated in the hands of the white minority. Mandela faced the challenge of addressing these economic disparities while maintaining a stable, functioning economy. He focused on policies that sought to uplift black South Africans while maintaining the support of the business community, particularly those who had been skeptical of the ANC's ability to govern effectively. His economic policies focused on broadening access to education, healthcare, and jobs for the historically disadvantaged population. In addition to reconciliation, Mandela prioritized nation-building and the establishment of a democratic government that would represent all South Africans, regardless of their race. The creation of a new constitution, which was adopted in 1996, was one of the most significant accomplishments of his presidency. The Constitution enshrined the principles of equality, non-racialism, and human rights. It established a framework for a democratic South Africa, where power was shared and protected by law. Mandela also worked to ensure that the African National Congress remained a broad-based political party that was open to all South Africans, including those who were once aligned with apartheid-era political movements. Nelson Mandela's presidency marked a historic moment, not only for South Africa, but for the world. His leadership became a global symbol of resilience, hope, and the triumph of justice over oppression. Mandela's ability to forgive his oppressors, his focus on reconciliation, and his unwavering commitment to democracy made him an iconic figure, not just in South Africa, but internationally. His global legacy as a symbol of peace and freedom resonated deeply with people who had fought against racial injustice, colonialism, and human rights abuses around the world. Mandela's status as a global leader grew after his presidency, and he became one of the most respected figures of the 20th century. He traveled the world, meeting with political leaders and inspiring movements for justice, peace, and human rights. His message of reconciliation and healing resonated in post-apartheid South Africa, but also found a universal audience. His approach to conflict resolution, his emphasis on dialogue and forgiveness, and his insistence on peaceful means of addressing political and social issues made him a powerful advocate for peace in international diplomacy. Mandela's influence also extended to the field of global human rights advocacy. He played a central role in advocating for peace in regions affected by conflict, including Rwanda, Sudan, and the Middle East. He was a vocal critic of injustices, such as the war in Iraq, and he used his platform to highlight issues like poverty, inequality, and HIV/AIDS, which continued to plague South Africa. He was instrumental in raising awareness about the HIV/AIDS pandemic, which disproportionately affected South Africa, and worked to break the stigma surrounding the disease. Perhaps Mandela's most enduring legacy was his ability to inspire ordinary people to fight for justice and equality. His own life story of struggle, resilience, and ultimate triumph served as a model for people everywhere. Through his example, Mandela demonstrated the power of individual action in the fight against systemic injustice and the importance of standing up for what is right, even in the face of overwhelming adversity. His contribution to the fight for racial justice, peace, and human dignity will forever be remembered as one of the defining achievements of the 20th century. So, what have we learned from this incredible journey through South African history? The moral of the story is simple yet profound. Resilience and unity in the face of adversity can change the course of history. From the Boer resistance to apartheid, and ultimately to the rise of Nelson Mandela's leadership, the story shows us that even the most entrenched systems of oppression can be challenged. It teaches us that through reconciliation, forgiveness, and collective action, a nation can overcome its darkest chapters and emerge stronger. Today, South Africa is an example of what can be achieved when people come together for a common cause, regardless of their past. Thank you for listening to this story today. If you enjoyed this deep dive into history, be sure to subscribe to this channel for more compelling content. We'll be back soon with more captivating stories from the past. Until next time, remember, history tells us who we were, but it's up to us to shape who we will become. See you next time.